we could have a long conversation about Japan-China relations, of course, which go back centuries, quite literally. And so there's a long and deep cultural, diplomatic, economic relationship between Japan and China. Of more recently, of course, in the 20th century, there was war and contest in Asia. And of course, the Japanese Imperial Army invasion of China continues to be part of the historical memory of many Chinese, most Chinese for that matter. So there's war legacy issues that color that relationship now as well. Chinese and Japanese modernization took a very different trajectory in the 20th century, but now you have a China that is feeling that it has accomplished what it has long set out. It has independent government, it has strong and prosperous economy, and it is building a military that will make sure, as Xi Jinping said, that it will never again be vulnerable to the military power of another state. So you see in Chinese aspirations for the 21st century, really making sure that the 20th century setbacks for China, war, conflict, occupation, are never to be repeated. But the Japan-China relationship is deeply affected by history. It's deeply reflected in their diplomacy. It's deeply reflected in each of their citizenry's memory and thoughts of each other. That being said, in the post-war period, of course, when China opened up to first diplomatic normalization with the United States and very quickly afterwards with Japan, this was a China that was led at that point by Deng Xiaoping, who wanted market opening, who wanted to bring China into a much more deeper integration with the global economy and to develop China according to not socialist principles exclusively, but also commerce and engagement and modernization, industrialization. And it did that through collaboration. Japan has long been a donor to Chinese modernization, and specifically from that period in the 1970s when Deng Xiaoping took over, Japan was the premier donor of official development assistance to China, built much of the infrastructure that we currently know of as underpinning Chinese economic growth and transformation. The diplomacy, though, continues to be colored by the territorial dispute, as you mentioned, over the islands that are offshore of Okinawa Prefecture, which is the southernmost islands of Japan, and it's between in the East China Sea between Japan and China. Nobody lives on those islands. There's no industry, there's no commerce, there's fishing in and around the islands by Taiwanese fishermen, by Chinese fishermen, by Japanese fishermen, but the islands remain uninhabited. And I think that's a little bit of the legacy of World War II. But the sovereignty dispute is real. Both China and Japan, and Taiwan for that matter, claim those islands as their sovereign territory. The other piece of the puzzle, of course, is what I mentioned earlier about economic integration. The Japanese economy is deeply integrated with the Chinese economy, and via Taiwan even further in terms of foreign direct investment in China's economy. So you've got a very close relationship in terms of the economic growth of China and the economic growth of Japan. Neither of those two countries can afford to, what we think of today as decouple, absent that economic part, the relationship between those two major economies. And again, remember, China is number 2 in the world and Japan is number 3. So these are large economic players, and they occupy somewhere between 5 to 8% of each other's national economy every year. So these are vital economic partnerships. So you still have the historical legacy issues, you have the territorial dispute, but you also have this deep economic engagement. And the diplomacy for both, I think, has become quite difficult. China is not as willing to try to coerce Japan, given its dependency on Japanese investment, especially business investment. Japan is not likely to really take on China head on, because again, it has deep economic interests in the relationship. But Japan is an ally of the United States. Japan is worried about Chinese military power that operates increasingly in proximity to Chinese territorial waters and airspace. And it's very worried about the way the Chinese military are operating in and around Taiwan. And for your listeners who don't know the geography of that region, the southern islands of Japan are about 100 kilometers or a couple hundred miles. Right? Less than a couple hundred miles from each other. So anything that happens across the Taiwan Straits has immediate and proximate influence on the security of Japan. So this is an area where Chinese growing economic power, it's the way it deploys that power, the way it exercises both quantitatively and qualitatively the capabilities that it has, very important to Japan and Japanese security.